The girl's hands trembled as she placed the locket on the counter. The police would later call her a runaway, a statistic. But the old black man behind the pawn shop counter saw something else in the tarnished silver. He saw a cage. He saw a monster. And he knew this wasn't a runaway case. It was a hunt. He had to find her before the monster did, because he was the only one in the world who could read the terrifying confession she had left behind. To the gritty, restless heart of the city, Jacob Miles was a fixture, a quiet island of calm in a sea of desperation. At 62, his face was a roadmap of a life lived listening more than speaking, his dark skin etched with the fine lines of empathy. He was the owner and sole proprietor of the Second Chance, a small, cluttered pawn shop tucked away on a forgotten street. His world was a museum of broken dreams and second-hand hopes, dusty guitars, tarnished silver, the quiet, ticking ghosts of 1,000 wristwatches. The neighborhood cops, the dealers, the desperate mothers, they all saw a simple, honest pawnbroker. A man who would give you a fair price for your grandmother's ring and never ask questions. They never suspected they were looking at a man with a peculiar and sometimes burdensome gift. Jacob had a form of intuition so profound it was almost a sixth sense. When he held an object, he could feel its story, not like a psychic, not in clear visions, but in echoes of emotion, in flashes of memory. The ghost of a lover's touch on a silver bracelet, the phantom scent of a child's soap on a worn teddy bear, the deep, gut-wrenching ache of loss in a wedding band. He was a curator of forgotten feelings, a librarian of lost souls. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, disguised as just another transaction. The bell above the door chimed, and a young woman slipped inside, moving with the nervous, hunted energy of a stray cat. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her clothes were cheap, her face pale with an exhaustion that went deeper than simple fatigue. But it was her eyes that caught Jacob's attention. They were wide with a terror so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to suck all the air out of the small shop. She approached the counter, her hands trembling as she opened her small, worn purse. How much can you give me for this?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. She placed a small, silver locket on the worn velvet of the counter. It was old, tarnished, and not particularly valuable. An ordinary piece of forgotten jewelry. Jacob picked it up. The moment the cool metal touched his skin, a jolt went through him, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. He closed his eyes, his practiced defense against the sudden, overwhelming flood of emotion. But it was too late. He felt what the girl had felt when she last held it. He felt the cold, damp concrete of a basement. He smelled the cloying, chemical scent of industrial cleaner. He saw a flash of a man's face. Not a clear image, but an impression of cold, dead eyes and a cruel, thin-lipped smile. And he felt a wave of terror so pure, so absolute, that it almost made him gasp. It was the terror of a caged animal who knows the hunter is coming back. He opened his eyes, his own heart pounding against his ribs. He looked at the girl, and now he saw not just a desperate runaway, but a victim, a prisoner. "This is a beautiful piece," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, a deliberate anchor in her storm of fear. "It seems very old. A family heirloom?" She shook her head, her eyes darting towards the door. "I don't know," she whispered. I need the money. For a bus ticket. I need to get out of the city." He knew, with a certainty that settled in his soul like a stone, that a bus ticket would not be enough to save her. The man with the cold eyes. He was not the kind of man who would let his property just walk away. "I can give you $50 for it," Jacob said, knowing it was more than the locket was worth, but also knowing it was a price he had to pay. "But I need your name. For my ledger. It's the law." "Lena," she whispered, not looking at him. "Lena Petrova." She took the money, her fingers brushing his, her skin cold as ice. "Thank you," she breathed. And then she was gone, the bell above the door a final, mournful chime. Jacob stood in the empty shop, the silver locket now feeling like a burning coal in his palm. He knew he had a choice. He could do what he had always done, record the transaction, place the locket in his display case, and let the ghosts of its story fade. Or he could do something he had not done in a very, very long time. He could step out from behind his counter. He could break his own rules. He could go looking for trouble. He thought of another girl, from another lifetime. A girl whose desperate pleas he had dismissed as the ravings of a troubled mind. A girl whose subsequent disappearance had become the great, unhealed wound of his life. He would not make that mistake again. He closed the locket and put it in his pocket. He then turned the sign on his door from open to closed. The quiet, unassuming pawnbroker was gone. In his place stood a man who had just been handed a map to a very dark place. A man who knew that a young woman's life depended on him learning to read it before it was too late. He was no longer a curator of the past. He was now a hunter, and he was about to start hunting a monster. Of course, here is the second part of the story, the pawnbroker's locket, continuing from where we left off. I've made sure this part is longer and more detailed to better fit the style you enjoy. Start of text file, part 2 of 5. Title, The Pawnbroker's Locket. The moment Jacob flipped the sign on his door to closed, the quiet, dusty world of the second chance transformed. It was no longer a simple shop. It was the headquarters of a one-man investigation, a mission he hadn't even known he was waiting for. The afternoon light slanted through the grimy front window, illuminating the floating dust motes, each one a tiny, silent witness to the girl's terror. He sat down at his worn wooden workbench in the back room, the space where he repaired watches and appraised forgotten treasures. He placed the tarnished silver locket on a soft velvet cloth under the bright, focused light of his work lamp. For a long moment, he just looked at it. It was cheap silver, poorly made, with a simple, floral engraving that had been worn smooth by time. To anyone else, it was worthless. But to Jacob, it was a container, a vessel filled with the dark, cold poison of the girl's fear. He picked it up again, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He closed his eyes, steeling himself, and let the echoes wash over him. This time, he didn't pull away. He focused, pushing past the initial wave of terror, searching for details. He felt the cold dampness again, but this time, he sensed more. He felt the rough, unfinished texture of a concrete wall against skin. He heard the faint, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of a leaky pipe. And he smelled it again. The sharp, acrid scent of industrial cleaner, a smell meant to erase, to sanitize, to hide a stain. But there was something else underneath it all. A different scent, faint but persistent. Iron. Like old rust, or like old blood. Jacob's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding. This wasn't just fear he was feeling. It was the residual terror of a place where something terrible had happened. A cage. A prison. He forced himself to calm down, his breathing slow and measured. The emotional echoes were a guide, but they were not a map. He needed something tangible. He picked up his jeweler's loupe and began to examine the locket with a practiced, meticulous eye. He was no longer a man feeling a story. He was a detective searching for evidence. He found the first clue on the clasp. It was slightly bent, the metal warped as if it had been pried open with force. On the back, almost completely obscured by tarnish, were a series of tiny, almost invisible scratches. They were not random. He tilted the locket under the light, adjusting the angle. The scratches formed a pattern. A number. 3B. It was a small detail, the kind a person would overlook unless they were specifically searching for it. An apartment number? A room number? It was a start. Next, he carefully opened the locket. Inside, there was space for 2 small photographs. Both were empty. But Jacob knew that the empty spaces could tell a story, too. He used a fine pair of tweezers to gently probe the inside of the frame. And he found it. Tucked deep behind the metal lip where a photo should have been, was a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper, no bigger than his thumbnail. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he unfolded it. On it, written in a small, neat, but clearly terrified hand, were 2 things, a date from 3 days ago, and a single, cryptic phrase. He watches the river. 3B. He watches the river. The clues were a whisper, a ghost of a message. It was a confession, a desperate plea left by a girl who was not just running away, but running from. His first thought was the bus station. A bus ticket out of the city. He had to know if she had made it. He grabbed his coat, the locket now safe in a small velvet pouch in his pocket. He locked the heavy iron gate of his shop behind him. The familiar, grating sound of final, decisive closing of a door on his quiet life. The city bus station was a river of noise and hurried, anxious movement. Jacob moved through the crowd, his quiet, observant presence a stark contrast to the chaos. He found the ticket counter for the long-haul buses and approached a weary-looking woman with a name tag that read Gloria. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "I'm looking for a young woman who might have bought a ticket this afternoon. About 18, pale, dark hair, looked scared." Gloria gave him a tired, cynical look. "Sir, I see 100 scared kids a day. They all look the same. You got a name?" "Lena," he said. She typed the name into her computer, her expression board. "Nope. No one by that name bought a ticket today. Not for cash, not for credit." Jacob's heart sank. Lena hadn't made it to the bus station, which meant she was still in the city, still in danger. As he turned to leave, a new thought struck him. The money. He had given her $50. Not enough for a long-haul ticket, but enough for something else. He walked over to the other side of the station, to the counters for the local and regional transit lines. He described Lena to the clerk there, a young man who seemed more interested in his phone than his job. "Yeah, maybe," the young man said with a shrug. "A girl like that bought a one-way ticket on the 3:15 p.m. bus, the one that runs up the river route. The North Line." "He watches the river. Where did she get off?" Jacob asked, his voice now tight with urgency. The clerk shrugged again. "Don't know. It makes a dozen stops between here and the county line. Could be anywhere." It wasn't a destination, but it was a path, a direction. Elias was on the North Line, following the river, trying to disappear. Jacob walked out of the bus station and stood on the busy street corner, the city's noise washing over him. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. He knew he had a choice. He could go to the police. He could give them the locket, the clues, the story of the terrified girl. They would file a report. They would treat it as another runaway case. And in a city with 1,000 bigger problems, it would be lost in the shuffle. Or he could follow the river himself. He could follow the ghost of a trail and the echo of a feeling. He thought of the girl's eyes, of the cold, absolute terror he had seen there. And he thought of the man with the cold, dead smile from his vision. He knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the pavement beneath his feet, that the police would be too slow. The monster was already hunting, and he was the only one who had the map. The city bled from bruised purple twilight into the deep, bruised black of night. Jacob did not go home. He got into his old, dented pickup truck, a vehicle as weathered and as reliable as he was, and began to follow the river north, tracing the path of the 3:15 bus. The locket was in his shirt pocket, resting against his skin. It was no longer a burning coal, but a piece of ice, a cold, steady anchor to the girl's terror. He kept one hand on it as he drove, not for any mystical guidance, but as a grim reminder of the stakes. The North Line bus route was a journey through the city's forgotten arteries. It wound its way out of the gleaming, indifferent heart of downtown, past the skeletal remains of old factories, their broken windows like vacant eyes staring out at the slow, dark ribbon of the river. It rumbled through working-class neighborhoods where the houses were small and huddled together for warmth, and then further north, into a desolate, industrial no-man's land of warehouses, scrapyards, and decaying riverfront properties. With each passing mile, the feeling from the locket grew stronger, the echoes of Lena's fear more defined. The general, free-floating terror he had felt in the shop now had a texture, a geography. He could feel the cold, oppressive silence of concrete and rusted steel. He could taste the metallic tang of the river air, thick with the ghosts of industry. She had been here. She had been held somewhere here. He knew he couldn't just drive the route aimlessly. He needed to narrow the search. 3B. He watches the river. The clues were a strange, poetic fragment. He began to think like the detective he never was, but had so often observed from behind his counter. What kind of place was 3B? An apartment? Unlikely. Most of the residential buildings in this area had been torn down years ago. A warehouse bay? Possible. But the second clue, he watches the river, felt more specific. It wasn't just by the river. It was watches. It implied a vantage point, a window, a place where someone could look out and see the slow, dark passage of the water. He pulled over near an old, defunct shipping yard, the chain-link fence topped with coils of rusted barbed wire. He took out a worn map of the city's industrial sector, a relic from his own past, from a time when he had been interested in the city's history, not just the sad, small histories of the objects that passed through his shop. He spread it out on the passenger seat, the truck's dome light casting a pale glow. He began to cross-reference the bus route with the map, looking for any property that might fit. He focused on a 3-mile stretch of the riverfront that was a graveyard of abandoned industry, a defunct power station, a series of old textile mills, and a long, low complex of brick buildings listed on the map as the North Bank Warehousing Depot. It was the depot that caught his eye. It was a series of long, identical buildings, each divided into numbered bays. Building 3, Bay B, 3B. A cold chill, entirely separate from the locket's icy echo, ran down his spine. It was a perfect match, and the front of Building 3, according to the map's layout, faced the river directly. He watches the river. Jacob sat in his truck for a long moment, the sounds of the city a distant hum. The locket in his pocket felt colder now, the terror within it more specific, more immediate. He was no longer just following a trail. He was approaching a destination. He was approaching the cage. He drove the last 2 miles slowly, his headlights cutting through the industrial gloom. The North Bank Warehousing Depot was even more desolate and menacing than it had looked on the map. It was a fortress of decaying brick and corrugated steel, surrounded by a high fence. The main gate was chained and padlocked. He parked his truck a block away, in the shadow of a rusted water tower. He got out, the night air cold and sharp. He knew that to go further was to cross a line, to step from the world of a concerned citizen into the world of a trespasser, a vigilante. He thought of the girl's eyes. He thought of the cold, dead smile of the man from his vision. He knew, with a certainty that was as heavy as the silence around him, that a phone call to the police would do nothing. They would need a warrant. They would need probable cause. By the time they acted, Lena could be gone forever. Or worse. He found a section of the fence where the concrete footing had crumbled, creating a small gap at the bottom. He got down on his hands and knees, the rough gravel biting into his skin, and squeezed through. He was inside. The warehouse complex was a city of shadows. He moved slowly, keeping to the deepest pools of darkness between the buildings, his soft-soled work boots making almost no sound on the cracked asphalt. He found Building 3, a long, low brick monolith that seemed to absorb the faint moonlight, giving nothing back. The large, roll-up doors for the bays were all sealed. But as he crept along the side of the building, he saw it. A single, small, steel door, slightly ajar. And next to it, painted in faded, peeling numbers, were the 2 characters he had been searching for, 3B. He took the locket from his pocket. The coldness was intense now, a physical, painful ache in his hand. The echoes were a chaotic, screaming storm of terror, of pain, of a desperate, final struggle. This was the place. This was the cage. He pushed the door open. It swung inward with a low, groaning shriek of rusted hinges, revealing a flight of concrete stairs leading down into an absolute, suffocating blackness. And from the darkness, a smell wafted up to meet him, the sharp, acrid scent of industrial cleaner. And underneath it, faint but unmistakable, the coppery, metallic smell of old blood. Of course, here is the 4th part of the story, the pawnbroker's locket, continuing from where we left off. I have made sure this part is substantially longer and more detailed, as you have requested. Start of text file, Part 4 of 5. Title, The Pawnbroker's Locket. Jacob stood at the top of the stairs, the darkness below a physical presence, a black, suffocating mouth that exhaled the ghosts of bleach and old violence. He took a small, powerful flashlight from his truck's glove compartment, its beam cutting a sharp, lonely cone into the gloom. He descended the concrete steps one at a time, each footstep a loud, deliberate intrusion into the absolute silence. The locket in his pocket was a shard of ice against his chest, the fear radiating from it a constant, chilling hum. The basement was vast, cold, and cavernous. The air was thick with the damp chill of the nearby river and layered with the smells he detected from above. The overwhelming scent of industrial-grade cleaner was a desperate, chemical scream, a clumsy attempt to erase a profound stain. And beneath it, subtler but more persistent, was the coppery tang of old blood, a smell that clung to the very pores of the concrete. His flashlight beam swept across the space. It was a typical warehouse basement, a graveyard of forgotten things, stacks of rotting pallets, rusted machinery draped in thick cobwebs, barrels of some unknown substance leaking a dark, viscous fluid onto the floor. But Jacob wasn't looking at the general chaos. He was looking for the specific. He was looking for the cage. The echoes from the locket were a chaotic storm in his mind. But as he moved deeper into the basement, they began to coalesce, to pull him in a specific direction, towards a far corner of the room that was hidden behind a towering stack of wooden crates. He squeezed through the narrow gap, the rough wood scraping against his coat. And then he saw it. It wasn't a cell with bars, but it was a prison all the same. It was a small, windowless room, constructed of cinder blocks, that had been built into the corner of the larger basement. A heavy, steel door, the kind used for industrial freezers, stood slightly ajar. On the door, stenciled in faded black paint, was the number 3B. Jacob's breath hitched. This was it. He pushed the heavy door open, its hinges groaning in protest. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness inside, and the full, horrifying story of Lena's terror hit him with the force of a physical blow. The room was small, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. The floor was bare, stained concrete. In the center of the room was a single, wooden chair, one of its legs splintered as if it had been kicked over with great force. On the floor, near the chair, was a dark, reddish-brown stain that the frantic, sloppy application of cleaner had failed to completely remove. Scuff marks marred the floor, the frantic, desperate dance of a struggle. But it was the wall that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the rough cinder blocks, clearly with a piece of broken concrete or a stone, was a series of frantic, overlapping tally marks, the desperate counting of a prisoner marking the passage of time. And next to them, a single, shakily drawn word, river. He watches the river. It wasn't just an observation. It was a clue, a label, a desperate attempt to identify her captor. He knelt, his flashlight beam playing over the floor. He saw something small and dark near the base of the broken chair. A button. It was ornate, made of dark, polished horn, the kind you would find on an expensive, tailored coat, not on the cheap clothes of a terrified runaway. He reached for it, then hesitated. He knew what would happen when he touched it. He took a deep, steadying breath and picked it up. The vision, the feeling, was overwhelming, more powerful than anything he had ever felt before. It was not just an echo, it was a memory. He saw through the man's eyes. He felt the cold, thrilling satisfaction of absolute power. He saw Lena, her face a mask of terror in the dim light of a single bare bulb. He heard his own voice, a smooth, cultured, terrifyingly calm voice, telling her that screaming was useless, that no one would ever hear her down here. He felt the rough texture of his expensive wool coat as he leaned over her. He felt the button pop off as she struggled, a minor, irritating inconvenience in his game. And he felt the cold, dead smile on his own lips as he watched her spirit begin to break. Jacob recoiled, dropping the button as if it were on fire. He stumbled backward, his own heart hammering, the ghost of the monster's satisfaction a vile, corrupting taste in his mouth. He finally knew, not just what the man did, but who he was, in a way. He was a predator who enjoyed the hunt, who savored the fear. A man of wealth and taste, who had a secret, ugly life in the forgotten corners of the city. He forced himself back to the evidence. He knew he couldn't stay here long. His logical mind, the pawnbroker's mind, took over again. He needed more than a feeling. He needed a name. He swept his flashlight beam across the small room one last time, looking for anything else, any other mistake the monster might have made. He found it in the corner, almost hidden in the shadows. A small, discarded object that didn't belong in a dirty, bloody cage. It was a custom-printed matchbook, the kind from an expensive restaurant or a private club. It was made of thick, black cardstock, and embossed on the front in elegant, silver script were two words, the Cypress Club. Jacob's blood ran cold. He knew of the Cypress Club. It was one of the city's most exclusive, most private, and most notorious gentlemen's clubs. A place where the city's most powerful men went to indulge their darkest appetites. A place protected by a wall of money and political influence. A place the police never touched. He picked up the matchbook. This was it. This was the mistake. The monster in the expensive coat was a member of the Cypress Club. He wasn't just a sadist. He was a member of the city's elite. Jacob knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the concrete floor, that this was no longer just about saving a lost girl. This was about hunting a monster who hid in the highest echelons of their city. And he knew that to go to the police with this, with a story about a ghost in a locket and a matchbook from a basement, would be worse than useless. They would either dismiss him as a crank or, worse, they would make a phone call to one of their powerful friends at the Cypress Club, and the trail would go cold forever. He stood up, the matchbook and the button now safely in the velvet pouch with the locket. He backed out of the small, terrible room, pulling the heavy steel door shut. It's grown a final, mournful goodbye. He walked up the concrete stairs and back into the cold night air, the smell of the river now a welcome relief from the scent of death and bleach. He had the monster's scent. He knew where he hunted. Now, he just had to figure out how to lay the trap. Jacob emerged from the warehouse into the cold, pre-dawn air, the city's distant hum a low, mournful song. The evidence in his pocket, the locket, the button, the matchbook, was a trinity of secrets, a map leading to the heart of a darkness he had only ever glimpsed from behind his counter. He knew going to the police was a fool's errand. The Cypress Club was a fortress of wealth and influence, protected by a wall of lawyers and bought-off officials. To walk into a police station with a story about a ghost in a locket would get him laughed out of the room, and it would alert the monster that the hunt had begun. He had to lay his own trap. He spent the next day not in his shop, but in the archives of the public library, poring over old society pages and business journals. He was no longer looking for a ghost. He was hunting a specific man, a man of wealth, who wore expensive tailored coats, and who was a member of the Cypress Club. He cross-referenced the club's known membership list, a thing of public record, however discreet, with articles and photos from the city's high society events. For hours, he found nothing. And then he saw him. It was a photo from a charity gala 2 years prior. A man in his late 50s, with a cold, handsome face, silvering hair, and a cruel, thin-lipped smile, stood with the mayor. The caption identified him as Alastair Finch, a real estate magnate known for his ruthless business practices and his reclusive nature. And on the sleeve of his dark, impeccably tailored coat was a row of distinctive, polished horn buttons. Jacob zoomed in on the photo until it was a blur of pixels, but he could see it. One of the buttons was a slightly different shade, a replacement. A mistake. Jacob now had a name. Alastair Finch. The monster had a face. His plan was dangerous, a long shot, but it was the only one he had. He returned to his shop and went to his safe. From it, he retrieved an object he had not touched in years. It was a vintage Patek Philippe watch, a masterpiece of Swiss engineering from the 1950s, left with him on a pawn ticket by a desperate man who had never returned. It was the most valuable object in his shop. It was his bait. That evening, dressed in his only good suit, a dark, simple wool that was clean but hopelessly out of fashion, Jacob walked up the granite steps of the Cypress Club. The doorman, a mountain of a man in a tuxedo, looked him up and down with open contempt. "This is a private club, sir," the doorman said, blocking the entrance. "I am here to see Mr. Finch," Jacob said, his voice calm and steady. "I have a business proposition for him. It concerns a unique timepiece he may be interested in acquiring." He opened the velvet pouch just enough for the doorman to see the glint of the watch's gold casing. The doorman hesitated. The watch was clearly authentic, clearly priceless. And men like Alastair Finch were known collectors. After a tense, silent moment, the doorman nodded and led him into a small, wood-paneled waiting room. The club was a hushed, opulent world of cigar smoke, quiet power, and the low murmur of men who owned the city. Jacob sat, the watch in his hand, the locket in his pocket, a cold, steady reminder of his purpose. He focused his gift, not on the watch, but on the room itself, on the echoes of the men who passed through it. And he felt it, the same cold, predatory satisfaction he had felt from the button. The monster was here. Alastair Finch entered the room, moving with the easy, confident grace of a man who owned the world. He was even more imposing in person. He looked at Jacob, then at the watch, a flicker of genuine interest in his cold eyes. "You have my attention," he said. "This is a 1952 Patek Philippe, reference 2499, Jacob began, his voice the calm, knowledgeable tone of a pawnbroker. One of only a handful ever made in rose gold. As Finch reached for the watch, Jacob made his move. A beautiful piece, he said, his fingers brushing against Finch's. It would go wonderfully with a dark wool coat, perhaps one with polished horn buttons. He saw it. A flicker, a momentary tightening in Finch's eyes, a shift in his breathing. It was almost imperceptible, but to Jacob, it was a signed confession. Finch recovered instantly, his face a mask of bored indifference. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," he said, examining the watch. "How much are you asking?" "I am not here to sell you a watch, Mr. Finch," Jacob said quietly. "I am here to buy back a girl. Her name is Lena Petrova." The color drained from Finch's face. The mask shattered. For a moment, Jacob saw the real man, the monster from the basement, his eyes filled with a cold, murderous rage. "You have no idea who you are dealing with," Finch whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. "And you have no idea who I am," Jacob replied, standing up. "I am the man who has a locket she left behind. I am the man who found your little room in warehouse 3B. And I am the man who has already made an anonymous call to a very dedicated, very honest police detective, telling him exactly where to find the girl you have moved to the top floor of the old textile mill on the river, the one with the single light on in the window." Finch was frozen, his mind racing, trying to find a way out of the perfect, inescapable trap. "They are on their way now, Mr. Finch," Jacob said, placing the watch back in its pouch. "With a warrant. It seems your confession, the one you left on a matchbook, was all they needed." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Alastair Finch standing in the opulent, silent cage of his own making. The raid on the old textile mill was a success. Lena was found, terrified and weak, but alive. The evidence in the room, and in the warehouse, was enough to bury Alastair Finch. The story of the quiet pawnbroker who had brought down one of the city's most powerful and monstrous men became a quiet legend in the neighborhood, a story whispered with a mixture of awe and disbelief. A few weeks later, the bell above Jacob's shop chimed. It was Lena. She was no longer the pale, haunted girl, but a young woman with a quiet, resilient strength in her eyes. She placed a small, familiar object on the counter. The silver locket. "I think this belongs with you," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You were the only one who listened to it." "How are you, child?" Jacob asked, his own voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself. "I'm healing," she said. "I'm staying at a shelter, and they're helping me. I'm going to finish school." She smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Because of you, I know I have a second chance." She left, and Jacob stood in his quiet, dusty shop, the locket now warm in his hand. The echoes of fear and pain were gone, replaced by a single, faint, and beautiful feeling: hope. He had not just saved a life. He had, at long last, healed the ghost of his own past. He was no longer just a curator of broken dreams. He was a mender of them. And he knew, with a quiet, profound certainty, that his work was just beginning. How many of our world's darkest secrets are hidden not in locked vaults, but in the small, discarded objects we overlook every day? And what might be possible if we learn to listen to the stories they're trying to tell us? If this story about the quiet power of empathy and the triumph of a humble hero moved you, please like, subscribe, and share. You never know whose silent story is waiting for a listener.